And this leads to a very interesting principle, which I formulated at the time, and I still think it's absolutely crucial. And it's one which I think, as an audience, you might want to think how often this happens. And the principle is very simple: is that social policies and the like are far more effective where they're least needed, and least effective where they're most needed. And that's a class principle, almost, lying there, which kind of says, our society is orchestrated around a fact. And that explains something to me about what had happened in those areas of Baltimore, where there had been this urban renewal. All of this money had been poured into this part of Baltimore to try to restructure things and rebuild things and make little pocket parks and all kinds of things like that. And you find it all goes back to total deterioration, because the population there was not able to have the kind of resources and the money which allowed them to actually pay a reasonable rent, and a reasonable rent would cover the reasonable reproduction and maintenance of reasonable housing quality. And in other words, the inequalities which are embedded in the market cannot be cured by dealing by these events like concentrated code enforcement, specific neighborhood reorganization and realization. And even when specific organization gets there, a very important principle comes out of that, which is the Engels principle. So Engels was kind of saying, how does the bourgeoisie approach its housing problems? Well, it approaches it by moving them around. So the other principle which I learned in the Baltimore housing market is the principle of moving it around. That if you've got a huge impoverished population, you may take a particular area and gentrify it, but you'll find that the impoverished population is no longer living there. A new class of people has moved in and occupied it, and so the neighborhood is improved, but it's not improved for the people who are living there. The people who are living there have been moved on, moved out, and have gone somewhere else. So these are the sorts of principles that you find. And one of the things then it immediately says, and was one of the things that really turned me on when I started reading Marx, was the recognition that you're dealing with a system. You're dealing systemically with something, and that you should always try to understand what is going on around you, not in terms of just simple kind of well, the problem is with the landlords. They're exploitative, and they're exploiting the inner city far more than they are exploiting other parts of the city, or the banks are, just greedy banks and so on. So instead of looking at it that way, you then look at the system, because that means that you have to change the whole system, and you have to also change the basic input into the system. And the basic input into the system, I was kind of very soon to discover, after thinking about this and working with this just a little bit in the early 1970s, what it was simply a class configuration. And the class configuration was about who has the money to support themselves in adequate housing. And can they do it through the market? And the answer there is that at least 50% of the population in Baltimore at that time, and I would say the same is true of New York City today, and also true of any major city in the United States today, that about 40 or 50% of the population is not in a position to afford adequate housing provision because of their impaired income streams. And for that reason, you cannot expect housing provision which is coming through the market to satisfy their requirements. In other words, there was a crisis of affordable housing back when I started working on it in 1969, 1970. It was a crisis of affordable housing. There's a crisis of affordable housing today. There will be a crisis of affordable housing tomorrow, and in 50 years' time, there will be a crisis of affordable housing in 50 years' time, simply because nobody's prepared to think about the kind of reconstruction of the organization of housing provision and that systemic kind of process which means that, no matter how well-meaning the efforts are, and how big the monetary commitment is, that principle, that the policies are going to be least effective where they're most needed and most effective where they're least needed, that is the principle which is going to prevail, unless we are prepared to rebuild the whole city system from the ground up.